Arnold Schwarzenegger is not just a legend. He is living proof that greatness can be carved out of pain, discipline, and an unshakable vision. He was not born into privilege, but into suffering and darkness. And yet he rose like a storm, forging his body into discipline, his will into steel, and his destiny into history. From the global stages of Mr. Olympia to the halls of power, from the unrelenting fury of the Terminator to the quiet poise of a statesman, Arnold has carried the weight of the world on his shoulders and never once let it fall. He didn't just change the game. He rewrote the definition of strength, of courage, of defying every voice that ever said, "You can't." For decades, he stood firm as a symbol of control, precision, and resilience in the face of pain. And today, with a personal fortune exceeding $1.2 billion, with fame reaching heights the world can only gaze up at, the cruel irony is this: no glory, no wealth can hold back the silent storm that is closing in. Because even the greatest hero must one day stumble. And now, as the curtain of age grows heavier, a brutal storm is rolling in. One that no spotlight can conceal and no muscle can withstand. At 79, Arnold is no longer fighting for titles or applause. He is facing a chapter more challenging than any role he has ever played. Before we begin, don't forget to hit like as a gesture of strength and respect for this extraordinary legend. Long before the cameras, the championships, and the billion-dollar fortune, there was a boy. A boy who knew the taste of cold floors, the sound of silence, and the weight of being unseen. Born on July 30th, 1947 in the small Austrian village of Thal, Arnold came into a world still marked by the shadows of war. Austria was rebuilding, but the scars lingered in its streets, in its homes, and in the hearts of its people. His family lived in a modest house without modern comforts, where winters were bitter and warmth was something earned, not given. His father, Gustav, a police officer shaped by a difficult past, ruled the household with stern discipline. Praise was rare, affection rarer still. Arnold would later recall that he feared not punishment, but invisibility, the quiet ache of feeling overlooked in his own home. The golden child was his older brother, Minhard, who seemed to effortlessly command their father's approval. Arnold, by contrast, was the quiet one, watchful, determined, yet rarely noticed. This imbalance planted in him a fierce hunger to prove his worth. "I knew love wasn't handed out in our house," he would say years later. "You had to earn it, and even then you might not get it." That realization hardened his resolve. He decided that if no one was going to lift him up, he would lift himself, literally. The problem was there was no gym in Thal, no shiny equipment, no mentor to guide him. What he had were scraps of metal, pieces of wood, and a cold cellar that smelled of earth and rust. In that dim space, lit by a single bulb, Arnold began shaping more than just muscle. Every improvised weight he lifted was a silent declaration. "I am here. I matter." The clang of metal became his answer to the silence upstairs. While other boys played outside or idled away summer afternoons, Arnold was underground, sweat dripping onto the concrete, picturing a life far beyond the borders of his village. On his bedroom walls, he taped magazine cutouts of bodybuilders, titans, who, to him, weren't just strong, but free. Free from smallness, from shame, from being unseen. He studied their poses as if they were sacred texts, memorizing the shapes and lines of the human form, not for vanity, but for escape. Strength, he would later reflect, wasn't about looking powerful. It was about surviving. In those years, survival meant building a body and a will so formidable that nothing, not poverty, not isolation, not doubt, could hold him back. By his early teens in the late 1950s, Arnold's world began to widen. He discovered a small gym in Graz, several miles away, and would bike for hours just to train there. The journey was grueling. Uphill rides in biting wind, returning home long after dark. But he relished the challenge. Each pedal stroke was a step away from the life he didn't want, and a step closer to the life he imagined. His friends thought he was obsessed. They were right. Arnold wasn't chasing a hobby. He was chasing freedom. In later interviews, he would speak of that time without bitterness, but with clarity. "I never saw a future in that village," he said. "I had to create one." And so, in the crucible of a cold Austrian cellar, and on the roads that led to Graz, a champion was forged. Not by applause, not by comfort, but by the quiet rebellion of a boy who refused to stay small. Those early years, hard and unrelenting, gave him more than muscle. They gave him the discipline, the vision, and the unshakable belief that he could outwork any obstacle. Long before the world knew his name, Arnold Schwarzenegger was already building the one thing that would define him forever: the strength to rise again and again, no matter how heavy the weight. When Arnold Schwarzenegger stepped off the plane in 1968 at just 21 years old, America was not the golden land of opportunity he had imagined. It was a battlefield he would have to cross alone. He arrived with a suitcase of clothes, a handful of dollars, and a dream too heavy for the thin wallet in his pocket. His Austrian accent wrapped around every word like chains, turning simple conversations into exhausting marathons. People smiled politely when he spoke, but many simply couldn't understand him. "I didn't know the words," Arnold would later recall. "So I spoke with my actions. Those actions meant work. Hard, unglamorous, bone-deep work." By day, he hauled bricks and swung hammers on construction sites under the California sun, muscles burning as he saved every dollar. By night, he trained in cramped, dimly lit gyms that smelled of iron and ambition, sculpting a body he was certain the world could not ignore. He rented small shared rooms, just a bed, a flickering lamp, and a place to hang his dream. Some nights he would lie awake, staring at a cracked ceiling, listening to the hum of Los Angeles traffic, and wonder if he had made the greatest mistake of his life. In those years, bodybuilding in America was still a niche obsession, far from the celebrated sport it would later become. Outside a tight circle of devotees, most saw it as a strange sideshow. To them, Arnold was just another over-muscled foreigner chasing an impossible fantasy. He knew there was only one way to change their minds: win and keep winning until they could no longer dismiss him. In 1970, at just 23, he became the youngest man ever to win Mr. Olympia. But each title came with suffocating pressure. "If I lost," he said, "I wasn't just losing a trophy. I was losing my place in this country." Every contest was a fight for survival, for identity, for the right to stay. The loneliness was sharper than the physical strain. Thousands of miles from Thal, Austria, he longed for his mother's cooking, the familiar hills of his hometown, even the stern voice of his father. But there were no arms to fall into here, no family to share the weight. America was loud, fast, and unyielding. His closest compions were in the gym, men who understood the language of pain and progress. Yet, when the weights stopped clanging and the lights went out, the silence returned. His body too exacted a price. In his relentless drive to grow stronger, he pushed past limits until they pushed back. Torn muscles, aching joints, deep bruises. They were not badges of glory, but warnings. Still, he pressed on. Pain became his currency, traded daily for a shot at the future he envisioned. He wrapped his knees, iced his elbows, and lifted anyway. The bridge back to Austria had been burned. The moment he left, there was no retreat. Through it all, he clung to a singular vision. A day when no one could overlook him, when his name would be etched not only into bodybuilding history, but into the culture itself. Every bead of sweat, every dollar saved, every night spent alone was a brick in the monument he was building to himself. Looking back decades later, he said, "I saw myself where I wanted to be, not where I was." That unshakable vision and the pain he accepted as its price turned a stranger in a strange land into a man the whole world would one day know. By the early 1970s, Arnold Schwarzenegger was no longer the outsider sleeping in a cramped room. He was the face of a sport. In 1970, At just 23, he claimed his first Mr. Olympia title, and by 1975, he had already stood atop the podium 6 times. The 7th would come in 1980, sealing his place as a legend. But behind the dazzling trophies was a truth few could see. Each victory brought not relief, but a heavier burden. The pressure to maintain a body sculpted to near mythical proportions meant training through pain, hiding injuries, and living on a razor's edge between triumph and breakdown. Torn tendons, aching joints, and the constant fear that one wrong move could end it all haunted him like shadows under the spotlight. "Winning makes you a target," he would say years later. "Everyone watches, waiting for the day you slip." Success had built him a throne, but it also made him a prisoner of expectation. Hollywood soon came calling, and in 1982, Conan the Barbarian turned him from a sports icon into a rising movie star. Yet even here, the climb was uphill. Studio executives laughed at his thick accent, called his name too long, too foreign, too impossible for a marquee. Roles were scarce, and rejection was constant. But Arnold, forged in the grind of bodybuilding, refused to yield. He studied acting, worked on his delivery, and when 1984's The Terminator hit theaters, the same accent they once mocked became a cinematic trademark. His line, "I'll be back," echoed around the world. Fame, however, has its own price. The schedules were merciless. Months spent on location, far from home, from family, from anything familiar. The distance carved quiet spaces in his life that no applause could fill. He had wealth, influence, and recognition beyond his wildest dreams. Yet some nights, alone in hotel rooms, he felt the same silence he had known as a young man in Los Angeles. And fame made every stumble louder. A movie that underperformed, a competition not won, even a personal misstep. Each one magnified because he wasn't just Arnold. He was Arnold Schwarzenegger. Success had built him a throne, but it also made him a prisoner of expectation. The same spotlight that lit his path could just as easily expose his flaws. Then came the transitions that would test him in ways neither iron nor cameras ever had. Retiring from competition to focus solely on acting, leaving behind the certainty of movie stardom to enter the unpredictable arena of politics in the early 2000s. Each move drew critics who questioned his motives, his abilities, his right to even try. Every choice carried the risk of erasing the image he had spent decades building. Yet he embraced the risk, knowing that stagnation was a quieter kind of death. "If you don't keep moving forward," he once said, "you start moving backward from the outside." It was all glory. The 7 Olympia crowns, the box office triumphs, the governorship. But those who looked closer could see the truth. At the peak, the air is thin, the nights are long, and the man on top is still in many ways alone. For decades, Arnold Schwarzenegger's body was his fortress, unshakable under the lights of Mr. Olympia, unyielding beneath the crushing schedules of Hollywood, unbreakable in the ruthless theater of politics. It had carried him across continents, into history books, and through storms that would have swallowed lesser men whole. But in 1997, at 50 years old, that fortress cracked. Fluorescent lights burned above him. The sterile, cold bite of antiseptic filled his lungs. Somewhere in the distance, a heart monitor pulsed out a rhythm that was no longer entirely his own. On that hospital bed in Los Angeles, he was not the Terminator, not the governor-to-be, not the 7-time Mr. Olympia whose body had been a living monument to human will. He was a man stripped to his most fragile truth, about to let surgeons cut into his chest to replace an aortic valve he'd been born with and kept hidden for half a century. It wasn't pride that had kept him silent. It was fear. Fear that the world would see what he had spent a lifetime outrunning, that even the strongest man in the room could be vulnerable. He didn't tell his mother back in Austria. She was aging, her hands already touched by time, and he refused to place another weight upon her shoulders. "I'll call her when it's over," he told himself. But in 1999, she was gone. No call, no goodbye. He was on set when the news came, the cameras rolling, muscles carved from decades of war with gravity. while inside, the sun in him splintered into pieces. The scar on his chest would fade. The scar in his heart would never close. And so he did what he had always done. He kept moving. Through the 2000s, there were film premieres where flashbulbs exploded like artillery, political rallies where the crowd roared his name, speeches that echoed through grand halls. The machine to the world still looked flawless. But in the quiet moments when the lights went down and the doors closed, his heart would whisper. He knew it would come again. In March 2018, at 70 years old, it did. What should have been a routine catheter valve replacement unraveled without warning into an emergency open heart surgery. "We made a mistake," the surgeons told him when he woke, confused, restrained, unable to speak through the tube in his throat. For a man whose entire life had been built on control, this was a private hell. Flashes of thought cut through the fog like lightning. His children. Will they remember me as strong? Or will they remember this? Maria? Does she still care? The press. What will they write? And always the image of his mother, gone without a goodbye, haunting him with the fear that he might leave his own children with the same wound. October 2020, 72, surgery number 3. By then, he no longer asked, "Why me?" There was no bargaining left, no denial, just a nod to the doctors, an unspoken acknowledgement that resistance was a useless weapon against time. Then came March 2024, 76 years old, still lifting weights, still smiling for cameras, still speaking to crowds that hung on his every word. But deep inside, the rhythm that had carried him through every battle began to stumble. Arrhythmia. The doctor said scar tissue from decades of surgeries was scrambling the electrical signals of his heart. The solution, a pacemaker. For most, a lifeline. For Arnold, it felt like a verdict. The man who had once bent steel with his bare hands, who had crushed records and stood alone at the summit of 2 worlds, would now live because a device told his heart when to beat. He looked at the doctor and whispered almost to himself, "I used to be the machine. Now I need one inside me." Days later, he went public through his podcast, Arnold's Pump Club. On the surface, it was about raising awareness, telling the world that even giants can fall. But those who listened closely could hear something heavier than words. The fatigue of a warrior who has counted too many scars to remember, and the quiet surrender that comes when you have fought every battle and know there are more ahead. Less than a week after surgery, he stood at an environmental summit. Lights flashed like 1,000 tiny suns. Applause thundered like distant surf. He smiled, the same smile that had charmed millions for decades. But beneath the tailored suit was a fresh line of stitches, a hidden pacemaker, and a man who now measured every handshake, every sunrise, every speech against the relentless ticking inside his chest. He had built a life on proving he was stronger than pain, stronger than doubt, stronger than failure itself. Now each morning his first act was to press his palm to his chest, not to test the hardness of muscle, but to feel the quiet mechanical pulse that kept him here. Not because he had conquered death, but because he had finally learned to hear it. This is the new Arnold. Not the unbreakable icon, not the invincible machine. Just a man with scars, some carved into flesh, others buried where no one can see, still pushing forward, even as the silence follows just one step behind. Sometimes the pain that cuts the deepest doesn't come from a surgeon's scalpel or the terror of a failing heartbeat. It comes from the slow, silent theft of a loved one's mind, from watching the person you once knew slip away while their body still stands before you. The world called Arnold Schwarzenegger a titan of strength, a force carved from iron and willpower, a man who had lifted himself from cold gym floors to the highest podiums of power. But there was no weight he could lift to stop the moment he looked into his father's eyes and realized the man he loved was already gone. It began years earlier in the early 2000s when Sergeant Shriver, the proud American diplomat, co-founder of the Peace Corps, husband to Eunice Kennedy Shriver, and the man who had shaped Arnold's moral compass and political dreams started showing small cracks in the armor. At first, they were almost harmless, forgotten keys. a repeated story told as if it were new, a name skipped over in the middle of a sentence. Arnold noticed, and his chest tightened because he had seen these signs before. An uncle in Austria who had faded into dementia the same way. He knew what was coming, and it was worse than any physical injury he had ever faced. As the months turned into years, the erosion quickened. The man who had once stood before presidents, spoken to nations, and inspired millions was now a fragile figure moving through rooms like a ghost in his own life. Then came the day that would carve a scar in Arnold's memory forever. It was a quiet afternoon visit. The sun fell in soft light across the room. Arnold leaned in to speak, expecting a smile, a spark of recognition. Instead, Sargent looked at him with a gaze that was neither confused nor frustrated, only vacant. "Who are you?" he asked, the words falling with the weight of 1,000 heartbreaks. Arnold's throat closed. He didn't answer. He couldn't, because in that instant his father, the man who had taught him how to knot a tie, how to speak with dignity, how to believe that public service could be a noble calling, was gone, not dead, gone. And there is no grief sharper, no wound more bitter than mourning someone who is still alive. Arnold would later admit in rare moments of vulnerability that this cut deeper than any of his surgeries, deeper than heartbreak, deeper even than his most public failures, because it forced him to face a truth that haunted him long after the funeral. What if one day I forget who I am, too? Watching Sargent fade wasn't just emotional agony. It was a cruel mirror. Every misplaced word, every lost moment, every blank stare became a whisper in Arnold's mind that neither muscle nor money nor medals could guard him from the slow, merciless erosion of memory. It haunted him in hotel rooms after speeches, in the silence between film takes, in the stillness of dawn before the world knew he was awake. In interviews, he kept his composure, saying all the right things, praising his father's legacy, talking about hope, promising to fight for awareness. But behind closed doors, his fear became a discipline. He overhauled his diet, added supplements, devoured research, began daily mental exercises, not to live longer, but to remember longer, because it wasn't death that terrified him. It was the thought of disappearing while still breathing. As the disease stole more of Sargent, Arnold's own reflection began to shift. He started to see time not as a mountain to conquer, but as a force to negotiate with, a rival you couldn't defeat, only delay. His workouts became less about sculpting bulk and more about building longevity. His speeches turned from ambition toward legacy, each word chosen as if it might be the last the world remembered him by. When Sargent passed in 2011, Arnold stood at the podium to deliver the eulogy. He was not the movie star, not the former governor, not the icon the cameras adored. He was a son, broken, grieving, and afraid. The cameras captured the public moment, the measured words, the strength in his voice, but they did not capture the private moment afterward. When Arnold sat alone in the back of the hall, staring at the empty chair where his father had once sat, tall and proud, he whispered something into the stillness too low for anyone to hear. Maybe it was a promise. Maybe it was a prayer that he would not let the same silent thief take him without a fight, that when his own time came, the world would remember him before it forgot his name. He had endured the silent agony of watching someone he loved fade into the shadows of memory. But nothing in that long history of heartbreak could prepare him for the storm he would bring upon himself. A storm born not of fate, but of his own choices. He had endured the silent agony of watching someone he loved fade into the shadows of memory. But nothing in that long history of heartbreak could prepare him for the storm he would bring upon himself. A storm born not of fate, but of his own choices. This was not an accident. It was the single mistake that would shatter the image he had built over decades, tear apart the trust of the people who mattered most, and leave a scar that no time or triumph could erase. For years, Arnold Schwarzenegger carried the crushing weight of a truth he could never speak aloud. He had fathered a child with Mildred Bayana, the family's longtime housekeeper, a woman who had been part of their home for over 20 years, trusted in the smallest moments of their daily lives. In 1997, Mildred gave birth to Joseph, Arnold's son. At almost the same time, Maria Shriver, his wife of more than a decade, gave birth to their youngest, Christopher. Two boys born within weeks of each other, growing up under the same roof. One openly acknowledged, the other hidden in plain sight. For over a decade, the secret lived within the walls of their home like a shadow that refused to leave. As Joseph grew, the resemblance to Arnold became harder to ignore. The broad shoulders, the posture, the unmistakable spark in his eyes. Maria noticed the similarities more than once, but love and trust blinded her to what her heart did not want to believe. She had stood beside Arnold through every reinvention, the relentless grind of bodybuilding, the scrutiny of Hollywood, the ruthless battles of political life, sacrificing her own career and privacy to raise 4 children under an unforgiving spotlight. She had been his partner in every war. But there was a war she didn't know she was fighting, and the enemy was already inside the gates. In 2011, the truth could no longer hide. Maria confronted Mildred, and the answer she received broke her world open. Arnold confessed without resistance, the words tumbling like stones that had been lodged in his chest for years. There were no elaborate explanations, no desperate lies, only the raw admission of a betrayal he could never undo. For Maria, it was more than infidelity. It was a deep fracture of trust, a public humiliation, and the realization that the life she had defended so fiercely was not what she thought it was. Quietly, she moved out of their home. Within days, the press got the story, and the world descended. Headlines screamed. Commentators dissected every detail. Strangers judged. But beneath the noise was the real devastation. 4 children, Catherine, Christina, Patrick, and Christopher, blindsided by the news, and a teenage boy, Joseph, suddenly thrust from the shadows into a storm of judgment he had never asked for. Arnold, now stripped of control, did what little he could. He acknowledged Joseph publicly, offered support, and tried to build a relationship. But even as the boy accepted his place in Tide, Arnold's life, the years of silence had already left their mark. Maria's rare public statement carried a grace that stunned many. This is painful and heartbreaking, but it is also part of life. In those words was the quiet dignity of a woman deeply wounded but unwilling to let bitterness define her. For Arnold, the shame was suffocating. This was not a scandal in his eyes. It was the moment he ceased to be the man his wife could lean on, the man his children could fully trust. He had built an empire on discipline, charm, and precision control. But this mistake stripped all of that away, revealing a truth far more uncomfortable than failure, that even he could destroy the very thing he cherished most. The fallout cut deeper than career or reputation. It was spiritual, shaking the foundation of who he believed he was. Years later, in an interview, he would say with unflinching honesty, "There's no one else to blame. I caused this. I hurt the person I loved most, and I'll carry that shame for the rest of my life." And he meant it, because behind the muscles, the films, the speeches, and the accolades stood a man who could never unsee the pain in Maria's eyes, never forget the moment trust died, never fully bridge the distance in his children's hearts. No Hollywood redemption arc could rewrite this chapter. Some mistakes do not vanish. They live with you quietly, relentlessly, every single day. He did not stand before cameras to plead for public forgiveness. Nor did he step onto talk show stages to explain himself, defend his choices, or twist the truth into something easier for the public to accept. Arnold Schwarzenegger chose silence, not as an escape, but as a deliberate act of responsibility, a decision to bear the full weight of his actions without turning his pain into a spectacle. When the truth erupted in 2011 and shattered the foundation of his family, he stepped away from the glare of the spotlight, retreating not in fear, but in acknowledgement that some wounds cannot be healed with words alone. There was no speech powerful enough to erase what had happened, and no explanation that could restore the trust that had been broken. In a rare moment of openness, he confessed to a close confidant, "There's no one else to blame. I did this, and I will carry it for the rest of my life." This was not a crafted press release or a carefully chosen line meant for headlines. It was the unfiltered voice of a man stripped bare, facing the reality of what he had lost, and accepting that some consequences would remain with him long after the headlines had faded. Maria Shriver, the woman who had shared decades of triumphs and trials with him, moved forward with grace and dignified silence, choosing the path of healing rather than public confrontation. Their children, though shaken by the storm and forced to confront a painful truth about their family, were given the privacy and protection they needed to process the pain in their own time. And Arnold remained present, not in the grand arenas where he had once thrived, but in the quiet behind the scenes where the painstaking work of redemption truly begins. There were no cameras to capture it, no crowds to applaud it, and no trophy waiting at the end. There was simply the difficult, often invisible work of showing up and taking responsibility. He never turned away from Joseph, the son whose existence had brought the hidden truth into the light. Instead, he began to build a connection brick by brick, not out of obligation, but out of recognition, responsibility, shared humanity, and the undeniable bond that had always been there in the boy's eyes and posture. They found common ground in the discipline of training, in the shared language of effort and perseverance, and in the unspoken understanding that while neither could rewrite the beginning of their story, they could choose how the chapters ahead would be written. The past would remain part of their story, but it did not have to determine everything that came after it. Arnold stayed equally committed to his 4 other children, Catherine, Christina, Patrick, and Christopher. He did not push for immediate forgiveness, nor did he attempt to erase the fracture with grand gestures or public displays. Instead, he chose to show up quietly, consistently, and without the flash of publicity. Birthdays, graduations, simple family dinners, ordinary moments that carried an extraordinary weight. Each moment became a quiet testament to the truth that rebuilding trust is not a single act, but a lifelong commitment. It is not something proven through one apology or one public gesture, but through years of presence, patience, responsibility, and the willingness to keep showing up when no one is watching. Professionally, he returned to the world of film. But the hunger for fame that had once driven him, the relentless desire to remain at the center of the spotlight, had softened with time. His appearances became more measured, his roles fewer, and his priorities began to shift. His focus increasingly turned toward causes and responsibilities that reflected the kind of man he was striving to become, rather than simply the image he had spent decades building. He championed climate change initiatives, stood in support of veterans, promoted physical health, and invested deeply in youth education. He funded after-school programs in underserved communities, constructed outdoor fitness parks to inspire healthier living, and contributed generously to Alzheimer's research, a tribute to Maria's father, Sergeant Shriver, whose legacy he continued to honor. These efforts gave his influence a different purpose, allowing the same fame that once defined him to become a tool for helping others. These acts were not designed for the cameras, and that was precisely the point. They were not meant to create another headline, repair his public image, or convince the world that he had become a different man overnight. They were simply part of the quieter life he was choosing to live after everything that had happened. For Arnold, redemption was never about reclaiming the adoration of the public. It was about standing day after day as a better man in the eyes of those he had hurt the most. It was about accepting that forgiveness could not be demanded, trust could not be rushed, and the consequences of his choices could not simply disappear because the years had passed. In the quiet of his home, he would sometimes take out old photographs, images from a time before the fracture, when smiles were easier and the air around the family felt whole. He rarely spoke when looking at them, but those who knew him well understood that his silence carried more weight, more sorrow, than any apology ever could. The photographs represented a version of his life that could never be completely restored, a reminder of what had once existed and what his own choices had helped destroy. He once reflected to a friend, "I built my life on discipline, but this was the one place where I lost it, and it cost me everything." In the years that followed, he never remarried. Though his name would occasionally be linked to companions, Arnold never again stood before an altar to take vows. Some said it was loyalty to the past. Others believed it was his own form of penance. Perhaps, deep down, it was his unspoken acknowledgement that he had once held something extraordinary in his hands and had ultimately let it go. Whatever the reason, there was no attempt to replace that chapter with a new public love story or erase what had happened by simply moving on. There was no sweeping finale to this chapter, no media-crafted redemption arc, and no dramatic moment when everything suddenly became whole again. Only a man in his 70s, continuing to stand by his children, guiding the next generation, mentoring young people from all walks of life, and carrying a scar. Not the kind that fades with time, but one that remains as a constant reminder of the lessons learned through pain, loss, and regret. For Arnold Schwarzenegger, that scar has become both his burden and his compass. It follows him quietly, reminding him of what he cannot change, while also guiding him toward what he can still become. A silent, enduring mark that taught him more about strength than any championship, any film role, or any political victory ever could. Because in the end, the greatest lesson was not how to become powerful, but how to live with the consequences of having power, how to accept one's failures, and how to keep moving forward without pretending the past never happened. At 79, Arnold Schwarzenegger is no longer the indestructible figure crashing through fireballs on screen or standing beneath the blinding lights of Olympia. But the steel in his will remains, tempered now by scars, quieter mornings, and a much sharper understanding of time. The body that once seemed almost invincible has changed, but the discipline and determination that carried him through decades of impossible challenges are still there. Most days still begin before sunrise inside his Brentwood, Los Angeles estate, a Mediterranean villa he purchased in 2002 for about $4.8 million. Now valued between $20 to $30 million. It is spread across 6 lush acres, with a 14,500 square foot T-shaped layout designed for privacy. Floor-to-ceiling glass opens toward the Pacific and Catalina on clear days. 2 elevators are dedicated to the guest wing for family weekends. There are dual kitchens, a warm, intimate one for daily life, and a sleek, entertaining kitchen opening to an outdoor BBQ and pizza station, a private theater, a wine cellar with a soda bar, a game and billiards lounge, a rare flat lawn, and a resort-style pool flanked by cabanas, terraces, and an outdoor kitchen with a smoker and stone oven. It is a home built not simply for luxury, but for privacy, family, and the quieter life Arnold has come to value. In the garage and hangar of his life, the artifacts speak as loudly as any role he has ever played. A Real Meters 47 patent tank from his Austrian military service. The AM General Hummer H1 that helped ignite a civilian craze. A custom electric-converted H1 that bows to the future. A modern Hummer EV. A BMW i7 xDrive 60. A Chevrolet Suburban for low-key family logistics. An Excalibur Series 2 Phaeton for flamboyant nostalgia, a Porsche 911 Turbo Cabriolet for sunset glides, and, as some profiles note, a Bugatti Veyron Grand Sport alongside a bespoke electric G-Class developed with a European e-mobility partner. Each vehicle reflects a different chapter of the man he became, from military beginnings and muscle car culture to the wealth and technology of his later years. When business or family calls him far, he boards his Gulfstream with 3,750 nautical miles of range and typically 12 plush seats, less as a status symbol than as a way to own his minutes after decades of chasing them. After spending much of his life racing toward the next achievement, the ability to control his time has become a different kind of luxury. Yet the most valuable engine he tends each morning is the one in his chest. The rhythm is steady now, thanks to a 2024 pacemaker, but each beat carries the memory of the aortic valve replacement in 1997, the emergency open heart surgery in 2018, and the third operation in 2020. Every morning is therefore more than another day. It is a reminder of how much his body has endured and how much time he has been given. He admits there were mornings post-surgery when opening his eyes felt like winning a lottery he hadn't bought a ticket for. The man who once measured himself in plates and reps now measures the discipline to stop before the pain starts. Training is precise, not punishing. The protein shakes have given way to plant-based meals rich in heart-friendly fats and greens. He meditates daily, and in short fitness clips aimed at men his age, he proves that discipline can outlast ego, even when muscle gives way to tendon, and tendon gives way to time. The goal is no longer to prove that he can push through everything. It is to know when to push, when to slow down, and how to keep moving for the years that remain. He never remarried after his 2011 split from Maria Shriver, still speaking of her with respect as the mother of his 4 children. For more than a decade, his partner has been Heather Milligan, a physical therapist. Their life together is quiet and steady, largely absent of the red carpet performances and public spectacle that once surrounded nearly every chapter of Arnold's life. At this stage, privacy itself seems to have become part of what he values most. His children stand firmly on their own. Catherine brings her young children by, letting him practice a gentler form of fatherhood. Patrick balances acting and entrepreneurship. Christina carves her own path away from the spotlight. Christopher lives grounded and steady, and Joseph, once the son in the shadows, is now fully in the family circle. Their bond was forged through iron, long talks, shared experiences, and the mutual vow to build forward without rewriting the past. The history cannot be erased, but the relationship can continue to grow, one ordinary moment at a time. As for the money behind the myth, Forbes 2025 places his net worth at roughly $1.2 billion. That fortune was not simply the product of chance, nor was it created by Hollywood alone. It was built from the same long-term vision and index card goals he wrote down the day he landed in America in 1968. The bricklaying business with Franco Columbu that thrived after the 1971 San Fernando earthquake. Early mail-order fitness ventures. The first apartment building he bought at age 25, opening the real estate floodgates that would later become a major part of his financial empire. Planet, Hollywood, and the lessons that came with it. Oak Productions. Publishing ventures. The Arnold Sports Festival, launched in 1989. And in 2018, co-founding the latter supplement brand with LeBron James before selling it in 2021-20. Each chapter added another layer to the financial foundation beneath the Arnold Schwarzenegger myth. But now, he chooses screen roles for meaning, not money. He pours his time, influence, and capital into public fitness parks, after-school programs, veteran support, environmental advocacy, and Alzheimer's research in honor of Sergeant Shriver, whose decline and legacy still shape Arnold's compass. There is no public will, but those close to him say his affairs are meticulously arranged. Another way of showing up for family, another quiet responsibility handled before it is ever needed. Age has carved lines into his face and slowed his stride, but his handshake remains firm. His eyes are still lit with the same spark that once propelled a young Austrian with nothing but a dream across an ocean. The body may no longer move with the speed or force it once did, but the determination behind it has not disappeared. Strength, he's learned, is not in how hard you hit, but in how steadily you stand. It can be found at graduations, on game sidelines, around dinner tables without cameras, and on morning rides through Brentwood, where each turn feels like a promise kept. These are no longer the moments that build a public image. They are the quiet moments that build a life. If the mansion is his fortress, and the machines his battalions, then the lesson of his late 70s is this: redemption is not loud, legacy is not opposed, and every quiet step forward counts, especially when the clock inside your chest reminds you exactly why you take it. After a lifetime spent chasing victories that the whole world could see, Arnold has entered a chapter where the victories that matter most may be the ones no one applauds. In the end, Arnold Schwarzenegger's story is not merely about muscles, movies, or medals. It is the odyssey of a boy from Thal who once stared past the Austrian mountains and imagined a life far larger than the narrow one laid before him. It is the long, difficult road from unheated gyms and halting English to the soft light of a Los Angeles morning, where his grandchildren's laughter now spills through the kitchen. Between those two worlds lies a lifetime of victories, sacrifices, mistakes, losses, and lessons that no championship could ever fully measure. It is the hard-earned wisdom gathered through victories, losses, and scars, both seen and unseen, that the strongest muscle any person can build is the one that keeps showing up. Not the muscle that lifts the heaviest weight, but the part of us that continues to rise after disappointment, continues to care after heartbreak, and continues to move forward when the easier choice would be to stop. We celebrate him not because he never faltered, but because he chose to change. He traded the roar of the crowd for the steady hum of a bicycle wheel at dawn. He traded the clatter of iron plates for the quiet weight of a child's hand. And somewhere between those two sounds, the definition of strength began to change. What once meant physical power and domination slowly became something quieter, more personal, and far more difficult to measure. He is proof that reinvention is not surrender. It is survival, and sometimes the bravest act a human being can make. To accept that the person you once were cannot remain forever, to acknowledge the scars left behind, and still choose to become something better takes a different kind of courage. Now nearing 80, with a heart that has been opened and mended more than once, Arnold reminds us that life's truest victories are not captured in headlines or trophies. They are found in the moments no one applauds, in the forgiveness extended, in the discipline kept when no one sees, in the responsibility accepted after failure, and in the choice to keep moving when stillness would be easier. Because in the final measure of a life, perhaps strength was never about becoming invincible. Perhaps it was always about having the courage to keep showing up, even after you have learned that you are not. If something in his journey speaks to you, let it linger. Share the part of his life that stays with you. Not just because it honors him, but because someone else may need that spark. Strength is not measured by how hard you can strike, but by how deeply you can care, how steadfastly you can endure. We are not born legends, but like Arnold, we can build ourselves into one choice by choice, day by day.